Ethan parked his car in front of the old building and let out a heavy sigh, staring up at the cracked facade. The 4-story structure stood before him, its peeling paint and dusty windows a reminder of better days long past. This wasn't the fresh start he had envisioned after the divorce, but it was all he could afford now. The second-floor apartment, run down as it was, represented the only chance he had at rebuilding his life. As Ethan unloaded his boxes, an eerie silence clung to the narrow hallways, interrupted only by the flickering of the fluorescent lights overhead. The building felt abandoned, lifeless. The janitor, a grizzled old man with a hunched back and a cigarette hanging loosely from his lips, barely spoke a word as he handed Ethan the keys. His gravelly voice carried a warning, though. "The walls here are thin. Keep the noise down." It was an odd remark, and Ethan found it unsettling. Still, he shrugged it off and continued into his new apartment. The space was small and barely furnished, just a sofa, a table, and a chair left behind by the previous tenant. It wasn't much, but it was his. As Ethan unpacked, arranging a few essentials, he allowed himself a moment of quiet relief. After months of turmoil, maybe this place could offer the stability he craved. The first few days passed without much incident. Ethan spent most of his time hunched over his laptop, working on freelance projects. The quietness of the building was initially a blessing, but soon he began to notice something odd about that silence, something that set his nerves on edge. There was a faint, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It wasn't loud enough to be disturbing, just present enough to be noticed. At first, Ethan dismissed it as an electrical issue, but the sound lingered, becoming harder to ignore. Then one night, just as he was drifting off to sleep, he heard something that made his skin prickle. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps, echoing above him as if someone was walking across the floor directly overhead. This wouldn't have bothered him under normal circumstances, except for one glaring detail. The apartment above him was vacant. The janitor had mentioned that the last tenant moved out months ago, and nobody had taken their place since. Ethan tried to shake off the feeling of unease, rationalizing it as his imagination playing tricks on him. But as the nights passed, the footsteps became more frequent, more distinct. They would start at odd hours, usually when the building was at its quietest. The noise would wake Ethan in the middle of the night, leaving him wide-eyed and tense. He would get up, check the rooms, inspect the doors and windows, but everything was always in place. Nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, small things began to gnaw at his sense of normalcy. A chair slightly out of position, a light he was sure he'd turned off found burning when he returned. At first, he wrote these off as his own lapses in memory, byproducts of the stress he had been under. But as the days dragged on, the sensation that something was wrong slowly took root. The days blurred into one another, each one feeling heavier than the last. Ethan grew restless, his thoughts often circling back to the strange noises that disturbed his nights. The footsteps above, once sporadic, had become a regular occurrence, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't explain them away. He even went as far as asking the janitor about it during a rare encounter in the hallway. "Has anyone been going into the apartment upstairs?" Ethan asked, trying to sound casual, though his nerves betrayed him. The old man just shook his head, his eyes narrowing as if he didn't like where the conversation was heading. "That place has been empty for months," he muttered before shuffling away without another word. That night, the sounds escalated. What had once been light, almost aimless footsteps now took on a steady rhythmic pattern, someone pacing back and forth directly above his bedroom. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, each step pressing down on his sanity. It felt like whoever, or whatever, was upstairs was deliberately tormenting him. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. Driven by frustration, he threw on a pair of shoes, grabbed a flashlight, and marched up to the 3rd floor. His heart pounded as he climbed the stairs, the air growing colder the higher he went. When he reached the top, he hesitated for a moment, staring at the dark, lifeless door in front of him. The apartment looked untouched. The doorknob, when he tried it, was locked, and a fine layer of dust clung to the frame, evidence that no one had entered in quite some time. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine as he peered through the small hallway window. The room inside was barren, just as the janitor had said. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He returned to his own apartment, his mind swirling with confusion and a growing sense of dread. There was no logical explanation for what he had heard, and yet the noises persisted. Each night, they seemed to grow louder, more intentional. Ethan began to notice other things, too. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would hear faint creaks within the walls, like something moving through them, slithering just out of sight. He told himself it was likely rats, or maybe the building settling, anything to keep his imagination from running wild. But the truth was, no explanation felt right. Then, something happened that Ethan couldn't dismiss as coincidence. Late one evening, as he sat at his desk trying to focus on work, he heard a loud thud coming from the kitchen. His stomach tightened. He froze in his chair, every hair on the back of his neck standing on end. Gathering the courage to investigate, he slowly made his way to the kitchen. One of the dining chairs was lying on its side. Ethan stared at it, his pulse quickening. He hadn't touched the chair in hours, he was sure of it. He knelt down, picking it up with shaking hands, trying to make sense of how it could have toppled over on its own. His mind raced, searching for any logical explanation. Maybe he had bumped it earlier and didn't realize it. Maybe the floor was uneven. But no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, a deep, gnawing fear took root. The chair couldn't have moved by itself. Ethan spent the rest of the evening trying to calm his nerves, telling himself over and over that he just needed to relax. But the fear didn't dissipate. The next morning, it only worsened. He left the apartment briefly to run some errands, desperate for a break from the tension that had begun to smother him. But when he returned, his heart sank. The door to his apartment was unlocked. Ethan was meticulous about locking up, especially after the divorce. It had become second nature. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities. Had someone broken in? Cautiously, he stepped inside. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but a strong, unpleasant smell hit him. A pungent mix of stale cigarette smoke. He wrinkled his nose. Ethan didn't smoke, and he certainly hadn't left the door unlocked. His breath caught as he scanned the apartment. He checked every room, every cabinet, every corner, but nothing was missing. No signs of a break-in, no damage, nothing disturbed. But the smell lingered, a smell that suggested someone had been inside, maybe just minutes before he returned. That night, he barely slept, tossing and turning in his bed. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were plagued by the same indistinct figure. Always watching, always lurking just out of sight. And now, even in the daylight, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was with him, unseen but undeniably present. The apartment that had once felt like a place to rebuild his life was slowly becoming something much darker. Something more sinister. The strange occurrences in Ethan's apartment didn't stop. In fact, they only became more intense. What once felt like the occasional odd noise had transformed into a relentless pattern, one that gnawed at his sanity. Ethan no longer felt like he was alone in his own home, and the feeling of being watched had evolved into something more palpable. Something he couldn't ignore. Desperate to make sense of what was happening, Ethan decided to take a more practical approach. If something was truly happening, he needed proof. Something concrete to show himself, or anyone else, that it wasn't just his imagination spiraling out of control. He went online and ordered a set of security cameras, hoping they would catch whatever was going on. Maybe, once he saw the footage, he could finally get to the bottom of this. The day the cameras arrived, Ethan wasted no time. He carefully installed them in key spots around the apartment. One in the living room, another in the hallway, and a third near the entrance. Each camera was positioned to cover as much of the apartment as possible. The plan was simple. If there was something there, the cameras would capture it. Then, he could decide what to do next. That first night, after the cameras were set up, Ethan lay awake for hours, listening for any sounds, any disturbances. But the apartment was eerily silent, as if whatever had been tormenting him knew it was being watched. The next morning, he reviewed the footage, his hands trembling with anticipation. Nothing. The apartment was as still and empty as it had been the day before. No strange movements, no footsteps, no shadows passing through the rooms. Ethan couldn't shake the frustration. He knew something was happening. He had felt it in his bones, but the cameras offered him no answers. He decided to keep monitoring, hoping that sooner or later, something would show up. And then, on the third night, it did. Ethan sat at his desk, reviewing the footage with a cup of coffee in hand. At first, it seemed like just another uneventful recording, but then, something flickered across the screen. His breath caught in his throat as he rewound the footage. There, in the living room, a shadow, a blur, moved slowly across the room. It wasn't fast or sudden, but slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking through, just out of reach of the camera's focus. What sent chills down Ethan's spine was the fact that the shadow moved while he was asleep in the next room. He stared at the screen, replaying the footage over and over, hoping to catch some clearer detail. But the shadow remained just that, a dark blur, with no clear form, no distinct shape. It was as if the presence was teasing him, letting him know it was there, but refusing to show itself fully. Ethan's first reaction was pure fear. His hands shook, his stomach churned, and his body went cold. His rational mind screamed at him to leave, to run as far away from the apartment as possible. But just as quickly as the fear had come, something else took over, denial. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or a malfunction with the camera. Ghosts didn't exist, not in the way people thought they did. He couldn't let himself believe that. The next morning, Ethan packed up the footage and took it to a nearby tech repair shop, hoping that a professional could find something he'd missed. When he handed over the USB drive to the technician, he explained as calmly as he could. "I think there's something wrong with the camera. It's showing weird things. I just need to know if it's faulty." The technician, a young guy with thick glasses, raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask any questions. "I'll take a look," he said, plugging the USB into his computer. As Ethan waited, his mind wandered. He couldn't help but start searching for answers on his own. While waiting for the technician to finish his work, Ethan sat in the shop's cramped waiting area, scrolling through his phone. His fingers trembled as he typed in search after search, digging deeper into the building's history. What he found made his skin crawl. The place had a dark past, one filled with tales of disappearances, strange occurrences, and unsettling rumors of hauntings that stretched back decades. It had once been a psychiatric hospital, a site of neglect and mistreatment where some patients had reportedly never left. The more Ethan read, the tighter his chest felt. Whatever was happening to him wasn't just a coincidence, it was part of something much larger, something far more sinister. When the technician finally returned with the drive, Ethan's heart raced. "Anything wrong with it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The technician shook his head. "Nope, cameras are working fine. No glitches, no errors. Whatever showed up, it's not a technical issue." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He thanked the man and left the shop, clutching the drive in his hand as if it weighed 100 pounds. If there was nothing wrong with the cameras, then what had he seen? And more importantly, what was he going to do about it? Back at his apartment, Ethan reviewed the footage again. The shadow was still there, taunting him, but now it felt different. It wasn't just something strange caught on film. It was real. It was in his home, watching him, waiting for him. He didn't sleep that night, and the sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, had never felt stronger. Ethan could no longer deny that something was terribly wrong. The constant noises, the shadow caught on camera, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched, it all pointed to something beyond the ordinary. He needed answers, and fast. But the more he searched for rational explanations, the more elusive they became. He tried talking to his neighbors, hoping to piece together any information that might explain what was happening. But most of them brushed him off, offering vague smiles or hurried excuses to end the conversation. It was clear that either they didn't know, or they didn't want to talk about it. Ethan was beginning to feel more isolated than ever. Then, one afternoon, while heading out for groceries, he ran into Mrs. Anderson, an elderly woman who lived on the second floor. She was friendly enough, and something about the way she glanced around the hallway before speaking made Ethan think she might know more than the others. "Excuse me, Mrs. Anderson?" he called out as she shuffled past. "Do you know anything about the apartment upstairs? The one above me?" The old woman stopped and looked at him with an expression that was hard to read, something between concern and caution. She hesitated before answering, lowering her voice as if she feared someone might overhear. "You're in 2023, right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded. The last man who lived there, well, he said strange things. He always felt like something was wrong in that apartment. He told people, but no one believed him. Mrs. Anderson paused, looking around nervously. Then one day, he just disappeared. No warning, no note. They searched for him, but it's like he vanished into thin air. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He'd suspected something was wrong, but hearing about a former tenant's unexplained disappearance hit him harder than he expected. His throat tightened, but he managed to ask, Do you think it's connected to what I've been experiencing?" Mrs. Anderson gave him a long, sorrowful look. "I don't know, but I'd be careful if I were you. Sometimes it's what you can't see that's the most dangerous." With that, she hurried away, leaving Ethan standing in the hallway, her words ringing in his ears. Later that evening, he made his way to the building's janitor, Paul, hoping the old man could shed some light on the situation. Ethan had tried talking to him before, but Paul had always been evasive, never giving much away. This time, though, Ethan wasn't going to let him off so easily. He cornered him near the maintenance closet and pushed for answers. "Listen, Paul," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I know something strange is going on here. I've heard things, seen things, and I just talked to a neighbor who told me the last guy who lived in my apartment vanished. You've worked here for years. You must know something. Please, I just need the truth." Paul shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if making sure they were alone. He let out a long, tired sigh before finally speaking, his voice low and gravelly. "This building, it wasn't always apartments, you know. Back in the day, it was a psychiatric hospital. Decades ago. Place was full of problems, abuse, disappearances. They say some of the patients never left, even after it was converted. But that's just talk, right?" Ethan's heart raced. "Disappearances?" He repeated, the word hanging in the air. "Yeah," Paul said, looking grim. "People don't like to talk about it, but weird things happen around here sometimes. Folks hear things, see things. It's not constant, but every now and then." Paul trailed off, shaking his head. "Look, kid, I don't have any proof. I just try not to think too much about it. But if I were you, I'd be careful. This place, it's got history." Ethan thanked him and returned to his apartment, a heavy sense of dread settling over him. The more he learned, the clearer it became that the building was hiding something dark, something that had claimed people before him, and might be after him next. That night, Ethan stayed up late reviewing the footage from his cameras again. This time, there was more. Faint, indistinct shadows seemed to flit through the rooms, just out of focus. He couldn't make out any clear shapes, but the movement was undeniable. It was as if the shadows had a life of their own, creeping through his apartment, always just out of reach. But then, something else caught his eye. He rewound the footage, his heart pounding. On the recording from his bedroom camera, in the dead of night, the sheet on his bed began to shift. Slowly, almost delicately, the fabric lifted at the foot of the bed, as though someone was carefully pulling it away from him. Ethan watched, frozen, as the sheet peeled back, inch by inch, creeping up toward his chest. His breath hitched as he saw it, a subtle but unmistakable indentation in the mattress, as if an invisible weight had pressed down beside him. It looked like someone, or something, had lain down next to him in the bed. Its presence captured clearly on the camera, even if it remained unseen to the naked eye. Ethan's blood turned to ice. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen, watching in horror as the sheet continued to move, the invisible figure making itself known in the most intimate and terrifying way. There was no more room for doubt. Whatever was in his apartment wasn't just watching him, it was getting closer. Closer than he could have ever imagined. The apartment, once a refuge where he had hoped to start over, now felt like a trap. It was suffocating him, watching him, pressing in closer with each passing day. The fear was no longer just an emotion. It was a physical presence in his life, tightening around him like a noose. Ethan barely slept, and now he wasn't just afraid of what might happen next. He was terrified of what he might never understand. If the last tenant disappeared without a trace, what would happen to him? It was time to get out. Ethan's fear had become something tangible, a presence that followed him through every corner of the apartment. Every flicker of the lights, every creak in the floorboards seemed loaded with sinister intent. The nights that had once offered some escape were now completely sleepless, haunted by the relentless terror of what might be lurking in the shadows. And then the supernatural occurrences began to intensify. One evening, as he tried to distract himself by watching TV, the lights in the apartment started flickering violently. At first, it was a brief flash, but then the lights began to pulse in an almost deliberate rhythm, casting eerie shadows across the room. Ethan jumped from the couch, his pulse racing. Suddenly, the sound of slamming doors echoed through the apartment, sharp and aggressive, as if something was moving between the rooms, furiously throwing doors open and shut. His heart pounded in his chest as he ran into the hallway. The door to the neighboring apartment had been vacant for months, yet it sounded as if something, or someone, was being thrown violently from one side of the empty space to the other. The noises were too loud, too aggressive to ignore. Just as he was about to investigate, the lights flickered one last time before plunging the entire apartment into darkness. Then, out of the oppressive silence, came a sound that chilled Ethan to his core. Laughter. It was low, muffled, and inhuman, like something deep and guttural. It echoed through the walls, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Ethan's body froze in place, every instinct telling him to run, but his feet felt glued to the floor. The laughter was wrong. It wasn't human. There was something distorted about it, like it was coming from a mouth that didn't belong to this world. Ethan stepped back, fumbling for the light switch, but the power wouldn't respond. Panic rose in his chest as he grabbed his phone, turning on its flashlight to illuminate the pitch-black apartment. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. It was as if something was breathing down his neck, watching him stumble through the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. When he finally reached his bedroom, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Ethan stood in the center of the room, shaking, his flashlight scanning every corner. But nothing appeared out of the ordinary. He was alone, or so it seemed. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The air became so cold that he could see his breath fogging in front of him. His skin prickled with fear, and that's when it happened. The bed creaked behind him. Ethan turned slowly, his heart thundering in his chest. His phone's light revealed an indentation on the mattress, the same unnatural weight that had appeared on the camera footage. He watched in horror as the sheet slowly lifted once again, starting near the foot of the bed, pulling its way up toward the pillow. And then, as if it had been lying in wait, the invisible figure made its presence known in full. Ethan's body tensed as the sheet sank under an unseen weight, forming the shape of a body right next to him. He could feel the mattress shift slightly under the pressure, the air thickening as if something was lying beside him, pressing against his skin. But no one was there. His breath came in shallow gasps, his legs trembling as he backed away. He knew this wasn't just a shadow in the corner or a strange sound from the walls. This was real. Something was in his apartment, something he couldn't see, but could now feel. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat in the living room, watching the camera feed obsessively, waiting for the next sign that the invisible presence would come back. But the night dragged on in agonizing silence, broken only by the occasional flicker of the lights or a distant creak in the walls. It was no longer just fear. It had become pure terror, the kind that rooted itself in the deepest parts of his mind. Ethan no longer felt safe, no matter where he went in the apartment. Every second, every breath, was filled with the dread that something could reach out and touch him. Ethan had finally found a new place to live, and his belongings were already packed and ready to go. Tomorrow, he would leave this cursed apartment behind for good. But tonight, this one last night, he would have to endure its haunting presence once more. The invisible force that had tormented him for weeks had worn him down mentally and physically. Every day in the apartment had felt like a battle to maintain his sanity. The sensation that something was always lurking just out of sight, watching and waiting, had become an unbearable weight on his shoulders. And though Ethan knew he was almost free, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't finished with him yet. It was on a particularly quiet night when the horror finally reached its peak. Ethan had been lying in bed, wide awake, listening to the faint hum of electricity through the walls. Everything felt wrong. The silence was too heavy, the air too still. Then it began. The sound of faint buzzing, like static or an electrical current running through the building. The lights started flickering again, casting unsettling shadows around the room. But this time, Ethan didn't wait to see what would happen next. He grabbed his phone and turned on the camera, determined to capture whatever was coming. The temperature in the apartment plummeted. His breath came out in visible puffs, and the air itself seemed to thicken, growing oppressive and heavy. Ethan felt a pressure on his chest, as though an invisible force was pressing down on him, making it difficult to breathe. Then it hit. A violent gust of wind swept through the apartment, doors flying open and slamming shut with terrifying force. The sound echoed through the rooms, disorienting Ethan. He struggled to stay calm, holding his phone steady, the camera rolling. Suddenly, the door slammed so hard it cracked the wall beside it, and the hallway lights went out completely, plunging him into darkness. And then, he saw it. In the corner of the living room, something began to materialize. A shadow darker than the night itself, twisting and pulsing as if it were made of pure darkness. It had no clear shape, no face or features, just a mass of writhing, pitch-black energy. Ethan's blood ran cold. He had never seen anything like it, but he knew deep down that this was the presence that had been haunting him. The shadow moved slowly, deliberately, and Ethan had the distinct sensation that it was studying him, observing him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He felt paralyzed, unable to move as the thing seemed to grow larger, its dark tendrils stretching toward him. It pulsed with energy, a force that was both terrifying and unnatural. Ethan tried to scream, but no sound came out. The pressure in the room was suffocating, like the air had thickened to the point where he couldn't draw a full breath. Desperately, he pointed his phone's camera at the shadow, hoping, praying, that the recording would capture it, that he could finally prove to himself and to others that what he had been experiencing was real. But the shadow kept coming closer, its dark mass looming over him, filling the room with its presence. Ethan's legs felt heavy, as if they were being held down by some invisible force, making it impossible for him to escape. And then, without warning, the room was plunged into an eerie, suffocating silence. The shadow froze, hanging in the air just inches away from Ethan. Time seemed to stretch, each second dragging on like an eternity. Ethan could feel the weight of its gaze, even though the figure had no eyes, just a void where they should have been. His hands trembled as he held the phone tighter, his pulse thundering in his ears. Slowly, impossibly, the shadow began to dissipate, fading back into the corner of the room as if it had never been there. The apartment was still, but Ethan knew better than to believe it had truly left. The lights flickered back to life. The door stopped slamming, and the apartment was quiet again, but the damage was done. Ethan collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, his phone still gripped tightly in his hand. He could barely process what had just happened. His entire body trembled, soaked in cold sweat, as he looked down at the phone. With trembling hands, Ethan played the recording. His heart sank. The footage was blurry, indistinct. Vague shapes moved across the screen, but none of it made sense. The shadow, the terrifying, undeniable presence that had nearly consumed him, didn't appear on the video at all. It was as though it had never existed. The footage showed nothing but dark, grainy images that told no story. Ethan felt a cold sensation in his gut. He had no proof. No one would believe him. And worse, he wasn't sure he even believed it anymore himself. His reality was unraveling, and he had no way to explain what had just happened. He sat there for what felt like hours, unable to move, his mind racing. The presence hadn't truly left, it had only retreated. And it was only a matter of time before it came back. Ethan didn't look back as he left the apartment the next morning. His bags were packed, his new place was waiting, and all he wanted was to forget the nightmare he had endured. But as much as he wished to leave it all behind, the invisible scars remained. The apartment had left its mark on him, deeper than any physical wound. For the first few days in his new home, a small, quiet house on the outskirts of town, things seemed peaceful. The oppressive weight that had clung to him in the old building was gone. The air here felt lighter, cleaner. He could finally sleep without the relentless feeling of being watched or the terror of waking to strange noises. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt like he could breathe. The tranquility was real, or at least it seemed to be. But the experience had changed him. The fear had become a part of him, burrowing deep into his mind. Any slight sound, a door creaking, the wind tapping against the window, would send a surge of anxiety through him. He would jolt awake at the smallest noise, his heart racing, half expecting to see shadows lurking in the corners, or feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on his bed. Even though the house wasn't haunted, Ethan couldn't escape the lingering effects of the trauma he'd endured. Each night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't help but think about the apartment he had left behind. He still couldn't fully understand what had happened there, and part of him wasn't sure if he wanted to. The more he dwelled on it, the more he wondered if leaving had been enough. The presence, whatever it had never been truly seen, only felt. And if it hadn't shown itself completely, could it still find him? Could it follow him, creeping back into his life when he least expected it? Despite the peace of his new surroundings, Ethan remained on edge. He had escaped the apartment, but he hadn't escaped the fear. It was still with him, lurking in the quiet moments, in the spaces between thoughts, in the dark corners of his mind. The terror hadn't disappeared. It had simply transformed, becoming part of him, impossible to shake. In time, he realized that the real horror wasn't what had happened in the apartment. The true terror lay in the fact that fear itself had become his constant companion, shaping how he saw the world around him. Even though the supernatural presence hadn't followed him to his new home, the psychological impact lingered. The apartment may have been behind him, but the trauma was not. Ethan lived with the gnawing suspicion that some things, once experienced, could never be fully left behind. The shadowy presence, the laughter in the dark, the cold weight of fear, they were always there, just beneath the surface of his new, seemingly peaceful life. And perhaps that was the most horrifying realization of all. Sometimes the things we fear don't disappear. They simply change shape, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The story hadn't repeated itself, not in the physical world, but in his mind. The cycle had never really ended.